She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the thin gold chain that hung around her neck, trying to see in her own eyes. Something she hadn't felt in years, worth something warmth, belonging, but all she found was silence, her reflection staring. Back like a stranger in a home that never became hers, this penthouse overlooking the entire city was his idea, a fortress of glass and marble. Where emotions had no space and every word echoed back unanswered, she had entered this marriage with dreams, naive perhaps, but pure, believing that maybe love could be built over time. Yes. If not found at first sight, he had promised her the world during their brief engagement. Smiled politely at her father during the wedding, offered her a house key and a credit card, and then disappeared into the whirlwind of board meetings, midnight calls, overseas trips, and more silence. 3 years, she counted it in seasons, in birthdays, celebrated alone in meals eaten quietly at a tent-sit dining table where she sat across from no one she remembered the first night. Clearly the bed was enormous, the sheets luxurious, but he had taken the guest room, said he had work, and she accepted it, assuming maybe he just needed space. One night turned to weeks, 2 months, and eventually it became normal to her, the distance. He maintained the polite indifference, the mechanical good mornings, and occasional businesslike inquiries about her health. She wasn't unloved, she was simply unacknowledged, a picture frame on the wall he passed every day without noticing. She tried in the beginning, dressing up for dinner, waiting by the door when he came home, leaving notes in his briefcase. Once she even cooked his mother's favorite dish, having learned it through an old cookbook, but he barely touched it, said he'd already eaten in the office. She had no clue what she had done wrong. She replayed every moment, wondering if she had spoken too much, if she had asked for too little, if she had been too plain, too quiet, too eager, too visible. And yet she still hoped maybe he'd wake up one day and notice the way her voice trembled when she said his name, or the way her hands lingered near him, hoping for a brush of skin. But years passed and her soul began to dry out like a rose pressed between the pages of a book never opened. Till one morning, sitting across from her friend in a quiet cafe, she heard herself say the words, "I don't think he knows what color my eyes are," and it wasn't said with anger or even pain, just realization, the kind that comes like a slow drip breaking a dam. Her friend reached across the table, squeezed her hand, and asked, "Why are you still trying?" And she didn't know why she kept waiting. Why she still set a place for him at dinner. Why she still wore the perfume he had once said smelled nice on her wedding day and that night. When she returned home, she didn't cry. She simply walked to the bookshelf, took out the old envelope where she had once written a letter to herself to be opened on her 3rd anniversary, and she read it aloud alone. In that empty living room where every corner echoed her silence, the letter was full of hope, full of what-ifs, full of promises she had made to herself about never settling for half-love, and suddenly she knew she had already broken every single one of them. The next morning she printed the papers, the divorce documents that had sat half-filled in her drawer for 6 months, waiting for a day she would feel brave enough to complete them. She signed them in silence, her hands steady, her eyes dry, and called his secretary to schedule a meeting, knowing it was the only way to guarantee he'd see her face to face. And as she walked into his office 2 days later, dressed in the same white dress she had worn on their engagement day, she saw him look up, distracted at first, then startled as if seeing a ghost from another life. He stood slowly, unsure why she was there, what emergency had pulled her from her quiet corner of his world, and she smiled a small, sad smile, placed the envelope on his desk, and said, "I thought you should hear it from me. I'm filing for divorce." His mouth opened, but no words came, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Confusion, maybe disbelief, perhaps fear, but not love. And that was enough for her to walk away, head high, heart aching, but finally free from the prison of longing that had kept her captive for 3 years. She took the elevator down, and with each floor passing, she felt lighter. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pretending was over, the pretending that this was marriage, that this was love, that one day he'd turn around and say, "I see you, I feel you, I need you." She walked out into the busy street and breathed in the city air. People moved around her, cars honked, life bustled, and for once she felt like she was a part of it. No longer a silent shadow waiting at the window of a house where She never truly arrived. She didn't know where she was going next, but she knew one thing. She would never again beg to be seen. She would never again settle for a love that made her invisible, and as the sun dipped behind the buildings and cast golden light on her skin, she walked on strong, not because she wasn't broken, but because she was finally done pretending she was an asterisk. He sat frozen, staring at the envelope, as if it contained a foreign language, something he had never expected, never prepared for. And though the room was silent, his ears rang with the weight of what had just happened. The woman he had married, the one he assumed would always be there, like the furniture, like the view from his office. Window had just told him. She was leaving, and not out of anger or drama, but with calm certainty and a voice that trembled only with finality, not fear. He had never truly looked at her, not really. She was always just there, polite, composed, a presence in the background of his life, who never demanded, who never argued, who never interrupted his relentless climb up the corporate ladder. He told himself she understood that he was building an empire for them, that love could wait, that affection was something to be unpacked once success was secured. But deep down he knew he had treated her more like a duty than a partner, a checkbox on a list of life's achievements. He married her because she was perfect on paper, elegant, respectful, from a good family, someone his board would approve of, someone who looked good in photos during galas and events, and she never complained, never asked why he never touched her, why he always slept in another room, why he never said, "I love you." He assumed her silence was agreement, when in truth it was endurance, and now her absence filled the room. More loudly than her presence ever did, he opened the envelope and read her note, not legal jargon, not blame, just a simple message that said, "I waited, I hoped, I loved in silence, and I can't do it anymore." He leaned back in his chair. The city skyline suddenly felt distant and cold, like a kingdom he had built at the cost of something he didn't even realize he was losing. He thought of the dinners, skipped the holidays, he worked through the times. She had stood in the doorway hoping for conversation, and he had waved her away with a brief distracted smile, as if she were just another employee, another task to deal with later. But now later had run out. He picked up his phone instinctively, then put it down, unsure what to say, or if she'd even want to hear it. His secretary knocked, asking if he was okay. He nodded, but the crack in his voice betrayed him, and as the door shut behind her, he finally allowed himself to feel the thing he had buried under ambition, vulnerability, not because he feared losing her image, but because somewhere deep he knew he had lost someone who had once been willing to love him through anything, and now she was gone, and he didn't even know what her favorite flower was, or what made her laugh, or why she sometimes looked like she was about to cry even when smiling. He realized how little he knew about the woman he shared a last name with, and how much she had probably ached in silence for years. He left the office early, something he never did, and drove home, a place that now felt more like a graveyard than a penthouse. Every corner of it had her touch, from the soft pastel curtains to the little notes she used to leave by the coffee maker. He found one tucked in the kitchen drawer, an old one yellowing at the edge that simply said, "I believe in you." Anna's knees buckled, not because he was weak, but because the weight of her quiet love hit him all at once, and suddenly he remembered moments he had ignored, like the way she used to wait by the door when he returned from trips, or how she always noticed when he was stressed and made chamomile tea without being asked, or how on their first anniversary, how she had set up candles and music and he had missed it because of a board meeting, and she never mentioned it again. He walked through the rooms like a ghost, retracing every step she had taken, wondering how he had lived with such beauty and never once truly seen it. He picked up a framed photo of them from their wedding day, her smile radiant, his posture stiff and professional. And now he saw it clearly, how even then she looked at him with hope, and he looked at the camera with calculation. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted bitter and empty, and he set it down unopened because for the first time in years he didn't want to numb. He wanted to feel. He needed to feel, because if he didn't, the ache might never teach him anything. He sat on the floor in the hallway, where her shoes used to be, and ran his fingers over the indentations left behind by the life she had taken with her, and he whispered, "I'm sorry," though no one was there to hear it. He didn't sleep that night, just watched the shadows shift across the walls and imagined her sleeping peacefully somewhere away from his silence, away from the coldness he had wrapped her in like armor. Now he understood why she always looked like she was searching for something, because she was looking for him, and he had never shown up. And as the sky began to lighten and the first rays of sun crept through the blinds, he made a decision, not out of guilt, but out of clarity. He couldn't undo the past, but he had to try. And say what he never said, he had to show her that he had finally seen her, and that her leaving had awakened the part of him that he thought was long dead. If she would let him, he would tell her that the silence wasn't because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to show it, that growing up love was a word. Whispered, not spoken, and touch was something earned through achievements not given freely, that he was scared of needing her, because need made him feel weak. And weakness was never allowed in the world he came from, but she had been strong for too long. And now it was his turn to carry the weight. And so he began to write, not a text, not an email, but a letter with his own hand, pouring onto paper everything he should have said years ago, about how her quiet strength humbled him, about how every act of kindness she offered chipped away at the walls he had built, about how her walking away had broken him in a way no financial loss or business failure ever could. And when he was done, he sealed the letter and drove across town to the address her lawyer had listed. He didn't expect her to open the door. He didn't expect forgiveness. He just needed her to know that she mattered, that her love had not been wasted, that even if he had arrived too late, it arrived. And as he stood outside the small apartment building, clutching the letter like a lifeline, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not control, not certainty, not pride, but hope. The raw, fragile kind that comes when a man realizes he might have been wrong about everything, and that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to make one thing right. And he waited, not moving, as people passed by, the sky turning deeper blue with the coming evening, and his mind filled with every detail of her that he had never taken the time to see before. The way she tilted her head when asking a question, the softness in her voice when she said goodnight, the strength in her silence when she never asked for more than he was giving. He waited, because he knew this was not a gesture. This was the beginning of unlearning a lifetime of being emotionally absent, and he knew that if she gave him even 5 minutes of her time, he would speak, not to convince her to stay, but to thank her for loving a man who didn't know how to love back until he lost the one person who did it so unconditionally, so quietly, so completely. Asterisk. She had just returned from the nearby market holding a small bag of groceries. When she saw him standing outside the building where she now lived, his presence there was so out of place, so jarringly unexpected, that for a moment she froze, watching him from across the street, as if he were a fragment of her past that had somehow wandered into the fragile piece she was trying to build. And yet there he was, standing, not with his usual arrogant posture or impassive expression, but holding a letter in his hands, and looking like a man who had just come out of a storm and was finally ready to admit he had been lost for a very long time. She looked away, pretending not to see him, hoping he would leave, but her feet wouldn't move. Her chest ached with something deeper than anger. It was exhaustion, the kind that only years of waiting and silence could bring. And as he turned, and their eyes met, she didn't flinch. She didn't smile, but something flickered between them, a thread that hadn't snapped entirely, even after 3 years of neglect and one final goodbye he took. A slow step forward, then another, and she stayed rooted, not welcoming, but not retreating either. She didn't want to hear apologies. She had written them all in her head already. She didn't want explanations, because explanations don't fill the hollow places inside a woman who spent every night curled up next to absence. He stopped a few feet in front of her and held out the envelope, not speaking, just offering it. And after a long pause, she reached out and took it, not because she wanted to open her heart, but because she needed closure, and maybe he did too. She said nothing as she turned and walked into the building, not inviting him in, not turning back, just holding the letter in trembling hands. And when she reached her small apartment and closed the door behind her, she leaned against it, breathing heavily, because just seeing him had stirred things she had buried deeply behind the walls. She had finally learned to build on her own. She sat on the floor and opened the envelope. The paper inside was creased, his handwriting rushed and imperfect, unlike the polished emails he was known for, and as her eyes moved across the words, she felt something Stir something painful, something real, because it wasn't just an apology. It was a confession of blindness, of fear, of emotional immaturity. He wrote about how he had grown up believing love had to be earned through performance, how he had been taught to show strength, not affection, and how every time she had tried to love him, it had terrified him more than any boardroom ever could, because she saw through him, through the suits and the titles and the polished armor, and instead of loving her back, he had shut the door and locked it from the inside. He wrote about how her leaving had broken something in him. Not his pride, not his ego, but the illusion that he could keep running forever without ever looking back. And now that she was gone, he finally saw the colors in the world she had tried to paint for him, every soft detail of their home, every quiet act of love, every time. She had waited just one more day, hoping maybe that would be the day he'd come to her with more than silence, and he ended the letter not with a plea, but with something raw. He wrote that he didn't deserve a second chance, but he would wait as long as it took, just for a chance to show her he had changed. Not to win her back, but to become the man he should have been from the beginning. Her hands shook as she finished the letter, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Not because it erased the past, but because it was the first time he had truly seen her. She didn't know what to do. She had spent so long learning to live without him, to breathe without needing permission to exist, without wondering if she was enough. She had built a life from scratch, quiet, humble, but hers. And now he stood outside asking for nothing but understanding, not with words, but with that letter that bled regret from every line. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, staring at the lights in the distance, wondering what love really meant. If it was something you could resurrect from ruins, or if it had to be reborn entirely. She remembered the woman she used to be, the one who wore lipstick hoping he'd notice, who stayed up late cooking his favorite meals, who cried in the shower so the walls wouldn't hear. And she remembered the woman she had become, the one who woke up to sunlight instead of silence, who smiled at strangers, who no longer waited for footsteps in the hallway. And she didn't know if those two women could coexist under the same roof again. The next morning, she opened her drawer and took out the journal she had started after she left him in. It were pieces of her thoughts, raw, unfiltered little fragments of healing. And in the last page, she had written, "If he ever comes back, I hope I'm strong enough to hear him without falling apart." She took the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it inside that journal, not as a promise, but as a part of her journey. Later that day, she saw him again in the lobby of her building. This time she approached first, her steps slow but steady, and when she stood before him, she looked into his eyes and said, "I read it, thank you." He nodded and said nothing more, waiting for her to decide. What came next? She asked him, why now? Why, after all this time? And he told her that when she left, he realized his entire life had been built on performance. And she was the only real thing he ever had, and he didn't know how to handle real, so he buried it under ambition. And when it was gone, the silence finally screamed. Loud enough to wake him. She didn't respond right away, because words weren't enough to heal what time had scarred, but something in his voice, something in his eyes felt different, not desperate, but honest. She told him she didn't know if she could trust him again, if she could let him back into the space she had worked so hard to protect. And he said, "I don't want you to trust me today. I just want you to know that I'll spend every day proving I can be worthy of your trust." And those weren't just words, they were weighted with intention and humility. He didn't try to touch her, didn't try to plead. He just stood there, like a man stripped bare of power, yet finally full of presence. And for the first time, she didn't see the CEO. She saw the man, the broken boy beneath the suit, who had finally come home to himself, and maybe, just maybe, was trying to come home to her. She told him she needed time and space, and he respected that. He gave her his number scribbled on the back of a receipt and said, "Call me only if and when you want to," and he left quietly without turning back. And over the next few weeks, she read the letter again and again, not because it erased the past, but because it reminded her that people can change if they're willing to bleed for it. She saw small signs of him trying, not in grand gestures, but in presence. He sent books he remembered she liked with notes saying, "This reminded me of you." He donated to the shelter she volunteered at anonymously, but she knew it was him. He didn't try to impress, he tried to listen, and in his silence, now there was no longer absence but intention. And one rainy evening, As thunder echoed through the sky, she found herself standing in front of the old house they once called home, and she rang the bell, not knowing what she would say, but knowing she had to face what still lingered inside. And when he opened the door, he didn't smile, didn't move, just waited, and she stepped inside. Not as a wife, not yet, not as a promise, but as a woman willing to see what was left to salvage. They sat across from each other, the same table, where so many dinners were left untouched, and this time they talked, really talked about everything, about her loneliness, about his fears, about how sometimes love isn't enough, if it's not expressed, and how silence can be louder than hate. And they cried and they laughed and they mourned what they had lost, and slowly, day by day, word by word, they began to rebuild not the old marriage, but something new, something honest, fragile. Yes, but alive and breathing. And though trust is not a door you walk through, it is a path you walk every day. They kept walking side by side, and maybe they would make, and maybe they wouldn't, but what mattered most now was that he had seen her, truly seen her. And she had found herself and refused to vanish again, and whether their future was written in the stars or in separate chapters, both of them had learned that love is not a performance, it is presence, it is patience. It is choosing each other again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, asterisk.